everyone, and thank you very much we will convene the August 20th meeting of the City of Los Angeles Audits Committee. Mr. Parks will join us shortly. He is chairing the Education and Neighborhood Committee, and there is an item on his agenda that has extensive public comment, so he's going to be late. But thank you very much, Councilmember Blumenfield, for being here today. And staff, can you read the first item into the record?
The first item is a City Controller report relative to an audit of the Los Angeles Police Department's controls over seized and forfeited assets.
Can staff come forward and present the item?
Good afternoon. My name is Siri Khalsa. I'm with the Audit Division of the City Controller's Office. On June 28th, under the previous Controller, Controller Wendy Gruhl, we issued this audit of the controls over seized and forfeited assets at the Los Angeles Police Department. The basic objectives of the audit was to determine the effectiveness of management controls over this entire process, which involves the seizure and forfeit of both cash and property, to make sure that LAPD has complied with the rigorous state and federal laws that relate to this process. The audit covered activities during 2011 and 12, and our field was conducted in late 2012 March of 2013. Basically, the forfeiture program is run by two distinct LAPD units. Both the Asset Forfeiture Investigative Detail, which is a unit of the Gang and Narcotics Division of LAPD, and the Fiscal Operations Division that basically accounts for the financial proceeds of the asset forfeitures. Our audit reviewed the entire process, beginning with initiation and the actual seizure of the asset as they were identified for potential forfeiture that involved the physical custody of the asset and the initiation of an actual legal forfeiture case by a prosecuting agency, all the way through the disposition of that forfeiture case and LAPD's receipt of their net share of proceeds. The total amount of the forfeiture proceeds that were posted as revenue by the department in fiscal year 12 was about $6.5 million. Our audit found that LAPD did have adequate controls over the actual seizure process, that is, the security and the custody of assets. We did not find any problems with malfeasance or misuse of those assets. However, subsequent to the actual seizure and the case was filed, we found significant areas that LAPD and the city needed to improve to ensure appropriate controls. Basically, LAPD lacked a comprehensive reporting process or a system that would be capable of accurately presenting the results of its entire program or operations. Because different divisions and agencies had various roles, no single unit was responsible for that entire process. So due to an ineffective and homegrown, outdated system and insufficient case monitoring and follow-up, the department lacked assurance that all the forfeiture cases were appropriately closed and that all proceeds had been received and deposited in the appropriate account. The audit included 4 key findings that resulted in 20 specific recommendations, and I can summarize them briefly if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first major finding was that LAPD had insufficient controls and information systems to support adequate reporting on the program. Again, because the unit's focus had been on initiating the case rather than proactive monitoring and ensuring the appropriate closure, the department was unable to report on program results or the current status of their forfeiture cases. In fact, when we began the audit, we noted their system had listed almost 3,000 cases were considered open. 40% of those had been considered open for more than 5 years. Once we started looking at that in a little bit more detail, we realized it was really more of a system and a process issue rather than true open cases. So that relates to the second finding. Because of this lack of monitoring, we were concerned if these cases that had been closed, if those net proceeds had actually reached where they were supposed to go. Either the net proceeds had been deposited, or if the forfeiture case was not upheld, that the asset was returned to its rightful owner. There was really 3 different distinct processes depending on the type of forfeiture case there were, so we really had to look at it from 3 separate perspectives. The first being the seizure of cash relative to state cases. These were cases that are closed by the district attorney. When those are resolved, the county sends a hard copy physical check to the city, and we found some issues relative to that. Under federal cases, if cash is seized, those monies are actually retained by the federal agencies until the case is closed, whereupon the agency will send a wire transfer to the city. Generally, it comes from the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury. We did find some issues relative to improper posting of the source of funds. The last process had to do with non-cash seizures. Sometimes assets such as jewelry, real estate, vehicles, these types of things were also seized and eventually forfeited. And we found some significant issues with documentation and case files not being updated. The third area really summarized, we noted opportunities. There were significant opportunities where LAPD could improve their processes to identify assets for potential seizure. We looked at their current process on how to identify narcotics-related cases that had a potential for asset seizure, and we recommended some improvements using some different information systems. We also looked at some other types of asset seizure, asset forfeiture type cases, and we made some observations, recommendations for PD management. Then the fourth area was basically a catch-all, had to do with additional efforts that we felt were necessary to absolutely ensure compliance with all these administrative requirements. Asset forfeiture is very highly regulated by both the state and federal law with significant penalties and compliance regulations, so we want to make sure that we are in full compliance. And we noted that LAPD must really strengthen their oversight in both tracking and reporting on these forfeiture activities. So LAPD has accepted those recommendations, and they're in the process of implementing them. They're going to now reconcile a lot of their internal records with federal reports. They are in the process of implementing a replacement system that will help facilitate their tracking and monitoring of cases, and they have modified some of their procedures for operations and reporting. They did submit an action plan relative to our audit recommendations, and based on our recent evaluation, we are considering 8 of the recommendations as implemented, 11 as in progress, and just 1 is not yet implemented. Okay.
Mr. Clerk, are there any cards for public comment?
There's no public.
Any questions?
A couple questions, yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to understand the assets that are, you're saying there was no malfeasance, which is good, but do we have a lack of understanding of where all the assets were over this time frame, or is it poor accounting, or are there big holes in terms of some of the assets that were forfeited, where they went?
Well, our audit generally looks at the entire process, and because we had different groups doing different things, what we really saw there were some gaps in that process. We did a significant amount of test work actually looking at specific forfeiture cases, and for those where we could have, a history or an audit trail, we were able to trace their eventual appropriate disposition. The problem was more about record keeping and really knowing what was out there. For some old cases that had been closed prior to 2005, there were no records that existed. So, for example, the checks that were written by the county, they no longer had a physical hard copy of this check. We had no record with enough detail to actually maintain with some level of certainty that those amounts actually were received and deposited. So there is a risk. We did not find any specific instances of things being lost or misused, again, but when there are significant gaps in a process, that always leaves a significant opportunity.
You're talking about $6 million.
$6.5.
$6.5 million. How much of that was unaccounted for?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't really compare that amount, again, because $6 million is really an annual what was brought in. We were looking at cases, again, 3,000 cases over the course of 10 years.
So about $7 million were before the 2004 time frame we researched. Several $1 million, in other words, were unaccounted for.
Were unaccounted for. And then what about, recently? If we were to say, last year, was there any unaccounted for? Or we did.
Well, it's more of a tracking and an oversight issue. Those that we were able to identify, and again, it took a lot of effort, even from an audit perspective, to actually get down to the hard copy check, or in some cases, the actual court filing case, in the custody of, either the courts or the district attorney, to be able to understand the actual true disposition And we were satisfied that those assets were actually ultimately dispositioned appropriately, but we could not get that information from the city or LAPD because they just didn't have it.
And then you said there was eight, one, and 1 were the 8 of the recommendations you felt were being implemented. 1 was in progress, and 1 was not acted on yet.
11 were in
11
progress.
were in progress.
11 were in progress. Okay. And so there are 20 altogether?
Yes.
So what, the other 9 are just not being considered, or?
8 are implemented.
Right.
11 are in
Oh,
progress.
8 are in, I got it.
And one more is not. And really, the one that is not implemented, it has to do with the receipt of hard copy checks from the district attorney. We made a recommendation that to better control this process, that the city work with the county to facilitate an electronic transfer of these monies to the city. And there's some disagreement as to that, but we feel like the recommendation was really for the city to convene a working group with the county and the city treasury to be able to figure out how to do this, because we believe it can be done effectively to better ensure the security and custody of these monies.
Do you have something to add?
Yes,
Or
good
introduce
afternoon.
yourselves?
Captain Ann Clark, Gang and Narcotics Division. We were obviously the subject of the audit. I'm here to address any concerns that you may have regarding items that are in progress. I will tell you that largely that revolves around 2 primary things. One is a complete retooling and overhaul of our tracking system. The system that we were using in the past was Paradox, which has been out of use since something like the 90s. We are currently building a system with our Information Technology Division. We hope to have it up and running and operational by the 1st of September. We will see how that works. That's going to be an Excel-based program, again, built to our specifications to track everything that we need to in the manner in which we need to track it. Part 2 of that is the Fiscal Operations Division piece, and they alluded to issues of checks from the attorney's office, how those checks are received in method or hard copy. They have a representative here today. However, they are convening working groups within the next several weeks, and we expect that that will continue to be a dialogue that will continue as to the feasibility of implementing those recommendations.
I have a couple of questions. How does the city use the proceeds of forfeited assets?
Will Newman, I work for Siri. I'm an auditor. There are strict rules about how the money can be used. It has to be used for law enforcement purposes, and federal money has to come into 2 funds that have been established just for that purpose, Fund 44D and 44E in the city system. One is for U.S. Department of Justice proceeds, usually the Drug Enforcement Administration. The other fund, 44E, is for U.S. Treasury, which would involve money laundering type of proceeds. Once they're in that fund, they have the SPA account. They have a separate $1.5 million they draw from these asset forfeitures for LAPD purposes, and it's presented to council for approval and so forth. The rest of the money is also has to be used for law enforcement purposes, and it's usually brought to council for buying motorcycles or buying other LAPD assets.
Do we use any of the forfeited property in law enforcement activities?
As far as there's only been one instance that I'm aware of in recent years where we have transferred forfeited property for use for the department. In that case, that was a horse trailer. Generally speaking, no. We're prohibited from transferring property to department use if it's seized under state guidelines. If it's federal, then that is a possibility, but typically if it's real property, that will be handled on the federal side, and we will merely get monetary proceeds in terms of our share of it.
And I know there's a lot of, because I was involved in writing some of them, I know there's a lot of state laws that deal with asset forfeiture when it deals with fraud against the elderly or domestic violence, and there's, where the money has to go to certain functions, like with the elder abuse, who just did a law last year that allowed them to capture the money up front so that these folks who were getting ripped off would be able to take the assets of the person who was defrauding them to help make them whole. Are those assets treated any differently, or how does that work when you have a overriding state concern like that?
What our audit found, and we actually addressed some of this in our recommendation, but basically LAPD's strategy and policy decision has been to pursue asset forfeiture only for those cases where there is a narcotics nexus that's governed by the California State Health and Safety Code, and also these financial crimes related to money laundering. LAPD does have some resources that are dedicated to a task force that's other than that,
the actual amount of assets available for forfeiture from any of these other types of cases that are out there is extremely small compared to the amount of money that we bring in on the narcotics side.
Extremely small for the department, but for a senior who's lost their entire life, could be a lifetime. So how is that? So what happens in those kind of cases where you have elder fraud and someone's lost their home and it may only be
Can we
worth
pull up a chair for her, please? Thank you.
$80,000 or $100,000, but to them
We have
it's
another one here.
their whole world.
Detective Elva Soriano, I run the Asset Forfeiture Unit for Narcotics Division. As far as those types of cases are concerned, those should be handled by the investigating criminal detective, and then they handle it within the DA's office. Ours are run pursuant to 11470 in the Health and Safety Code, and that's what gives us the authorization to go forward with a narcotic case. So as far as an elder abuse case, then the investigator that's responsible for that particular case would talk to the DA and handle it via them.
So the DA so it would be a different
Absolutely.
asset forfeiture process
Absolutely.
entirely.
We would not even be able to commingle those monies from from that particular case, for instance, elder abuse, into our narcotics funds.
Right. Although we're not just talking about narcotics funds in this audit, right? We're talking about all LAPD funds. I mean, all asset forfeiture, not just narcotics.
Every dollar or net proceeds that are attributed to some type of a forfeiture process that is received by the city are accounted for in one of these three funds. But those primarily, we researched it quite extensively and worked with department management that they're not aware of any other receipt or proceeds relative that the city had a share of relative to pursuit of other statutes other than these two areas.
I might add my perspective, and that is that as you get into this, you learn that there are administrative forfeitures which happen almost by rote, but you have criminal forfeitures where the forfeiture occurs as the process, as a part of the criminal case, and they try to avoid those because they're more involved, and the way they do most of their asset forfeitures is through a civil process, which has much lower threshold for proving the money guilty. They actually charge the money instead of a person, in rem, as they call it. And so they can proceed separately from a criminal proceeding. In fact, sometimes the criminal proceeding may prove not guilty, but the money is still guilty. So that's on the narcotics nexus side. And I think what you're referring to with elder abuse is more of the criminal, and that's why Detective Soriano was saying it's going to be tied up in the criminal case, and there's evidentiary rules that prevent their unit from jumping in usually because it would disrupt the criminal case. Is that correct?
That's correct, and as well as you have to file the criminal case. When you file the criminal case, you also have to file the forfeiture case or the money laundering case at the time. So it has to be investigated previously during the criminal investigation.
Right. So in a case of fraud against the elderly, they take the case, they file it at the same time. They find out someone's been defrauding a bunch of elderly people of their life savings, and then, at least according to state law, the state can basically freeze their assets during the trial, and then because I got involved in this because these guys were spending all their assets on their defense, and then they would spend down the victim's money. So the state law says you can't spend down the victim's money, and then the victim can get that money on the back end. But maybe this is apples and oranges. I don't know.
We deal strictly narcotics. We work narcotics division.
Right.
What you're
You
seeing
deal
there,
strictly in narcotics, but the
We did have
audit was
an
across the
observation
board.
and a recommendation for the chain of command to review the current strategy, and apparently that it will review and evaluate the goals of this program, but at the time of the audit, and at least at our exit conference, there was a focused decision that that this unit and the department was focusing efforts strictly related to these two areas.
I just want to clarify, I think Detective Soriano will agree that in the case you're describing, the court would have control of the money, not the city. And when the trial is over, the court is going to say, okay, so-and-so, you victim, you get this money. So the LAPD process doesn't really get involved in that sense.
Or may have any type of equitable sharing proceeds relative to that.
And one final question. Out of the 20 recommendations, you mentioned 11 were still ongoing. Do you have a deadline for that? Or when you're going to wrap those up?
Generally speaking, those are self-imposed deadlines.
Okay.
As I spoke to earlier, anything involving implementing the controls via the new computer tracking system, we're setting a launch date of September 1st. And again, that will be to look at the system that has been built for us internally, see if it works for our needs. I foresee there will probably be some adjustments to it or some tweaks as we implement it and we see what bugs may exist in it. And if that works for us, that will be the system that we proceed with. If we find significant deficiencies that can't be overcome internally, then we may find ourselves in a position of looking for some type of off-the-shelf product. I don't know what that will look like right now, but that is really very much plan B. We are hoping to be able to handle it internally for cost measures and just in terms of expediency and building it to our particular specifications. So that's the target date on that. As to issues regarding rewriting some of our asset forfeiture policies, our asset forfeiture policy and manual has not been rewritten since about 1995. We have a target date of finishing that up by the end of the year. And again, as mentioned earlier, for the issues in terms of the money and how it comes into the city and the accounts that it goes to, that will be handled by our commanding officer of Fiscal Operations Division. And she envisions setting up meetings post-Labor Day to start that discussion with the various county entities and to facilitate that coming into the city in a more expedient manner so that we're no longer in the position of getting paper checks.
Well, without any further questions, do you have anything else? No? I'd like to continue the item and request the controller to forward the LAPD response and controller evaluation to the Audits Committee. Thank you. Can you read the second item into the record?
Councilmember,
Yeah.
we would also, I'm Paul Smith, the CLA. We would also like to repeat our recommendation that, our request to the controller that all those responses be forwarded to the committee simultaneous when it goes to their file system. Because it doesn't come to the council
Correct.
file index. It just goes into there. So when the clerk has the item, we want all the responses to come before the committee and not just the one from the controller.
Correct. Thank you.
I think it's just a timing thing. It was just signed last week.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Item number 2 is a city controller report relative to the performance audit of the City of Los Angeles' commodity procurement practices and subsequent follow-up correspondence. This item was continued from September 13, 2011.
On this item's members, I would like to continue this item because this item goes back to 2011 and became a dispute between the Controller's Office and General Service Division upon the audit. So there hasn't been any follow-up on this issue ever since. This is a major audit on the operational issues facing the city, and I'd like both the GSD and the Controller's Office to bring back their updated responses within the next 30 days. I will schedule this item to be heard back sometime in September and would like to then move forward with this item. Are there any cards, comments? Okay, any questions?
Yeah.
So we will move this item with no objections, then we will continue this item to another date, probably in September. Thank you.
Thanks.
Item 3?
Item number 3 is a City Controller report relative to the fiscal year 2010-2011 audited financial statements for the City of Los Angeles.
Good
Hello.
afternoon. I'm Sally Rocio from the Financial Analysis and Reporting Division of the Controller's Office. And our division prepares the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, or CAFR, every year. We submit it to the to the Government Finance Officers Association for Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. The cover shows the financial transaction and results of operation of the city as of fiscal year end. It includes the financial statements of all enterprise funds like DWP, airports, harbor, the Municipal Improvement Corporation of Los Angeles, or MICLA, the retirement systems, lasers, the DWP retirement, and in fiscal year 11, it includes also the CRA financial statements. It is read by investors and bond rating agencies, so it is really important that we release our CAFR on time. The CAFR is prepared in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, and standards issued by the governmental accounting standard boards. It has 3 sections: the introductory section, the financial statement section, and the statistical section. The introductory section consists of the controller's transmittal to the mayor and council, as well as some information on the discussion and information of the city, about the city. The basic financial statement includes the citywide financial statements, schedules, and statistics that is required by the GASP. As of financial highlights of the CAFR for fiscal year 2011 shows that total assets of the city amounted to 48.3 billion, and total liabilities is 27.8 billion, with a fund balance or net assets of 20.5 billion. The net assets of 20.5 billion consist of 13.3 billion in capital assets net of related costs, 5.6 billion of restricted net assets, which means that resources are subject to certain restrictions on how they may be used, 3.3 billion unrestricted net assets pertaining to business type activity like the DWP, airport, SCM, sewer construction maintenance fund, and the harbor. And 1.8 billion deficit for governmental activities. The general fund shows total assets of 1.8 billion, total liabilities of 1.2 billion, and fund balance of 520 million. Of which 26 million is non-spendable, 240 million is assigned, and 254 million is unassigned or reserved and undesignated. Total bonded debt and long-term notes payable at June 30, 2011 was 21.6 billion. 4.1 billion is for governmental activities and 17.5 billion for business type activities.
Thank you very much.
Uh-huh.
Thank you for your hard work and congratulations on your awards for excellence. Do you have any questions, Councilmember Blumenfield?
Well, this is generally a report about our audit. I mean, what's our rating at this point?
Rating on
Our
bond ratings?
yeah.
It depends actually on GOB. I think it's Moody's it would be an R. It depends on the bond issue.
Yeah.
So
And I guess that's, and more related to the, what our specific rating is in those ratings, did they comment about some of the breakdown that you just described in terms of recommendations of how it should or shouldn't be in terms of our asset to liability ratio or anything to that effect?
I believe the bond rating agencies take that into consideration when they rate the city. So the latest it depends on the latest issue. The CAO usually process our debt. They're in charge of the issuance of debt. And before we issue the debt, they requested the bond rating agencies to rate it. Our latest issue is the TRAN, the Tax Revenue and Anticipation Notes. And I believe it's AAA for S&P. And it's high for that. So it depends on the type of bonds that we issue.
And that'll determine the cost of, I mean, that would be interesting to me to sort of look at this document and sort of compare it to, how it impacts our rating overall and cost of money and that kind of thing. But anyway, that's not really a question, it's more of a thought, so I'll turn it back.
We could come back to you if you have some questions,
We could actually provide you with an updated rating of all the issuances that the city has received. So we can ask that. Actually, I asked the CAO to provide me with an update this morning, and we will include that in our next
That'd be great.
CAFR for
Thank you.
fiscal year 2013.
You'll include those ratings in
We
there?
include the rating information of the city's bonded issuances in the CAFR.
Great.
Okay, so if there are no other questions and no objections, we will note and file this for the record. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies. Well, this conclude there are no public comment cards, correct? So this concludes our agendized items for today. Thank you very much. Anyone here for public general comments? Sir, no? You're with the department? Oh, so sorry. He's held up in our other committee. Well, that concludes our audits committee and meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.